Marie Antoinette wasn't the most tragic figure of the French Revolution. It was her husband, King Louis XVI. What books never mention is that the couple was genetically way closer than you've been told, the result of a strange inbreeding secret shared by their ancestors. We'll also expose a terrifying confession Louis hid in his diary and the cruel reality of what happened to the royal couple after the guillotine fell. The most shocking details of Louis and Marie's private lives are overshadowed by the tragedy of their execution. For this reason, many people don't even know they were inbred. Marie actually had a visible deformity because of this. She made sure it wasn't shown in portraits, but in real life, it was impossible to hide. Marie was born into the House of Habsburg, a royal dynasty infamous for marrying relatives to keep land and power within the family. When it comes to Marie's husband, he was a bit luckier than she was. His parents were first cousins once removed. This might not sound as shocking, but his ancestors had so much repeated intermarriage that his genetic relatedness was much stronger than that of ordinary first cousins, making his number of unique ancestors drastically lower than it should have been. But there was one thing that saved Louis from the deformities his wife Marie did not escape. Despite being King of France, he was not genetically purely French at all. That was normal for royals. Meanwhile, French peasants were often more locally French than the king himself. Louis came from a deeply interconnected web of European royalty. His father, Louis, Dauphin of France, was mostly French. His grandmother, Marie Leszczyńska, was Polish. His mother, Maria Józefa of Saxony, brought in the German and Austrian side. Because his family was more mixed, he had more genetic variety. This helped protect him from some visible effects of inbreeding. But Marie Antoinette didn't have this type of protection. Her parents, Maria Theresa and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, were second cousins. But because her dynasty had already intermarried many times in the past and had low genetic diversity, she faced consequences that she made sure did not appear in the portraits we see today. She hired skilled court painters, most famously Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who knew exactly how to flatter the queen's ego while keeping her recognizable. The most extreme example of Marie's condition appeared in the Spanish line of her family, most famously with King Charles II of Spain. His inbreeding was so severe that his lower jaw stuck out so far he could not chew his food or speak clearly. By the time Marie was born into the Austrian side of the family generations later, the inbreeding was not quite as extreme, but she still inherited the family's well-known features. For Marie, the trait was mostly cosmetic. Her lower jaw was slightly prominent, and she had the classic thick Habsburg lower lip, which dropped a bit when she was tired or angry. But Marie and Louis were also closely related to each other, and their marriage was absolutely the strangest among monarchs at the time. One of the most overlooked parts of Marie and Louis's marriage is that during their wedding celebration, there was a massive accident that took the lives of hundreds of people. Louis was never born to be king. In fact, he spent the first decade of his life drastically overlooked and living in the shadow of his bright, beloved older brother. He was third in line to the throne, and nobody expected him ever to rule. But a series of tragic family deaths completely changed the entire history of France. The person everyone expected to succeed their grandfather, King Louis XV, was Louis's older brother, Louis Joseph, Duke of Burgundy. He was confident, charming, and highly intelligent. Their parents openly adored him and poured all their time, energy, and resources into training him to be the perfect future king. But in 1760, the first tragedy occurred. The Duke of Burgundy was pushed off a toy papier-mâché horse by a playmate. He died in March 1761. Historians suggest likely because of bone tuberculosis. With the eldest son gone, the title of heir remained with their father, Louis Ferdinand. Just 4 years after losing his eldest son, Louis Ferdinand caught tuberculosis. He died in December 1765 at the age of 36. Completely unprepared, Louis was now the direct heir to the most powerful kingdom in Europe after his grandfather. This was the beginning of his problems. Louis's marriage to Marie Antoinette was very controversial at the time for a heartbreaking reason. Around 1756, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically during a historic event called the Diplomatic Revolution. A dangerous new power was rising, Prussia, located in modern-day northern Germany and Poland, backed by the massive financial power of Great Britain. For nearly 2 centuries, France and Austria had been bitter, mortal enemies. They fought constantly for dominance over continental Europe, bleeding each other's treasuries dry in war after war. Realizing they were both threatened by this new alliance, France and Austria did the unthinkable. They set aside their 200-year conflict and became allies. But it wasn't that easy. In the 18th century, a treaty on a piece of paper wasn't considered truly secure unless it was sealed with royal blood. The architects of this alliance, Marie Antoinette's formidable mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, and the French king, Louis XV, decided to lock in the peace by merging their dynasties. But there was a huge catch. For generations, France's bloodiest and most expensive wars had been fought against Austria. French families had lost fathers, sons, and brothers fighting the Austrians. Suddenly, the French government was telling the public that Austria was their best friend, but many people saw Marie as an Austrian spy. To make it even more bizarre, because of their families, Marie and Louis were actually related in hundreds of different ways. The easiest way to describe their connection is that they were second cousins once removed through their shared descent from the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. When Marie and Louis finally met, a series of disastrous events began. During Marie and Louis's wedding celebration, fireworks caused a huge tragedy. In life's cruel irony, just 23 years later, the exact place where this occurred would be renamed the Place de la Révolution, and both Louis and Marie Antoinette would be executed by guillotine in that very spot. On May 14, 1770, Louis met his Austrian bride, Marie Antoinette, for the very first time. The meeting took place in the forest of Compiègne. It was a strictly orchestrated royal spectacle, but the meeting was very awkward. Because Louis's parents had been so utterly consumed by grief for his older brother, Louis was largely ignored. His tutors treated him harshly, constantly telling him he was inferior to his late brother. This brutal upbringing is exactly why he grew up to be so painfully shy, chronically insecure, and plagued by self-doubt, especially when it came to women. When Marie Antoinette knelt before his grandfather, King Louis XV, the young Dauphin simply stood by, rigid and silent. He offered her a formal kiss on the cheek, and that was about it. But Marie was the complete opposite of Louis. She was lively, charming, and desperate to please. On May 16, 1770, their wedding at the Palace of Versailles was a staggering display of wealth, power, and high-stakes theater. It was designed to show the world that France and Austria were the undisputed rulers of Europe. But 2 weeks later, during the grand finale of their weeks-long wedding festival, a tragedy occurred. At the time, royal protocol was incredibly strict. The festival in the city square was meant specifically for the everyday people of Paris to celebrate the royal wedding. While the festival was thrown entirely in Louis and Marie's honor, they actually had to stay behind at the Palace of Versailles. It was a massive festival. The highlight of the night was a grand fireworks display meant to celebrate the union. The display was designed by the famous Italian pyrotechnicians, the Ruggieri brothers. Unfortunately, a sudden strong gust of wind caught the active rockets, blowing them back down into the crowd and toward a temporary storage area holding unignited explosives and scaffolding. The resulting explosions filled the square with dense, choking smoke. The wooden structures caught fire and collapsed, triggering instant mass panic among the thousands of spectators. The official death toll was recorded as 132 or 133 people, though contemporary rumors and unofficial accounts suspected it was much higher. When the young Marie Antoinette and Louis heard the news back at Versailles, they were reportedly devastated. They donated their entire personal allowances for that year to help the families of the victims. However, in the 18th century, the damage was already done. The French public was deeply superstitious, and many widely viewed the wedding night slaughter as a definitive sign from God that this marriage was cursed and would bring nothing but ruin to France. And they were right. Not long after, another tragedy occurred, one that completely destroyed 18th century France. Like any modern couple, Louis and Marie also had serious private problems within their marriage. However, in their case, literally all of Europe was watching them, expecting them to do the one thing they had no idea how to do. To cope with this, the young queen threw herself into high-stakes gambling, late-night masked balls, and lavish fashion, which destroyed her reputation. The pressure became enormous in late April 1774, when Louis's grandfather collapsed while hunting. He had contracted smallpox. Because the king was 64 and had led a famously indulgent life, his body stood little chance. By the morning of May 10th, 1774, it was clear the king would not survive the day. A candle was placed in the window of the king's bedchamber. The court was told that the moment Louis XV drew his last breath, the candle would be extinguished. What happened next was described by eyewitnesses, including Marie Antoinette's lady-in-waiting, Madame Campan, as sounding like a roll of thunder. It was the physical sound of hundreds of courtiers simultaneously sprinting down the grand wooden corridors of Versailles. They were rushing away from the king's rooms. Louis was only 19. Marie Antoinette was only 18. They were waiting together in a room when the crowd rushed in. Everyone bowed and shouted, "The king is dead! Long live the king!" The reality of their new responsibility hit both teenagers instantly and brutally. According to historical accounts, they fell to their knees, weeping and clinging to each other. Louis famously cried out, "Oh God, guide us, protect us, we are too young to reign." They were completely unprepared, especially for one crucial thing. There was also no time to properly mourn the old king. Smallpox was very contagious, so the palace had to be cleared quickly. Within hours, the new king and queen, along with the royal family, got into carriages and left Versailles for the palace of Choisy. Louis XV's body was quickly sealed in a coffin, covered with spirits of wine, and buried at night with little ceremony to help stop the disease from spreading. Now Louis and Marie had one main duty, to have a son who could inherit the throne. But the truth was, they had no idea how. This story is one of the most bizarre in the history of European monarchy. This problem had a surprising solution. To educate them, a close relative of one of them had to have a serious and uncomfortable talk with the couple. But that was not the only thing that made Louis very different from other European rulers throughout history. While he also loved hunting, making a list in his private diary that suggested he took the lives of around 200,000 animals, he did not do one thing. This is where the story gets even more fascinating. Back then, it was considered completely normal and expected for kings to have mistresses. The position of royal mistress was actually a political office. It was how nobles gained influence, favors, and money from the king. Compared to his grandfather and great-great-great-grandfather, who had dozens of them, Louis had none. You might think this was actually a good thing that Louis genuinely saw adultery as a sin and decided to stay faithful to Marie. But ironically, this was actually very dangerous, especially for Marie herself. It backfired horribly. First, because Louis did not have any mistresses, the nobles could not manipulate him in this way. In previous reigns, if the king spent too much money, the public blamed the mistresses. Because there was no mistress to absorb the public's hatred of royal spending and greed, all of that hatred was redirected at Marie Antoinette. To make matters worse, historians suspect that Marie may have had an affair herself. While people at the time suspected Louis's brother, Charles Philippe, of being her lover, there's actually no historical evidence for this. The most enduring theory involves Axel von Fersen the Younger, a dashing Swedish diplomat. Fersen and the Queen were undeniably close. He was a regular member of her private circle, and he later risked his life for the royal family. But the strongest hatred Marie faced came from the way people weaponized the couple's first 7 years of childlessness. To finally fix the issue, Marie's brother, Joseph II, traveled to France and had a frank, man-to-man conversation with Louis in 1777. The advice worked. Despite their rough start, Louis and Marie Antoinette grew to be incredibly close friends and, eventually, loving partners. Louis respected Marie's strength and courage, and Marie appreciated his warmth and kindness. They shared a quiet, private family life with their 4 children, which was highly unusual for French monarchs. But this was exactly the moment when everything fell apart in a darker way than they could ever have imagined. The execution of King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette was not just a sudden burst of anger, as many people believe. The couple actually made a terrible mistake during the revolution that angered the poor, whose condition was far more tragic than you might imagine. French society was divided into 3 strict classes, known as estates. The system was entirely set up to benefit the wealthy few at the expense of everyone else. Louis actually tried to be a good king compared to previous rulers. He was not a cruel tyrant who hated his people. He was a deeply religious, well-meaning man who genuinely wanted to be loved by his subjects. Early in his reign, Louis attempted several major reforms that were surprisingly progressive. He hired brilliant financial ministers who told him the truth. France's economy would collapse unless the rich nobility and the church started paying taxes. Louis agreed and tried to pass these laws, but he had zero self-confidence. Every time he tried to tax the nobles threw a tantrum and resisted. Instead of using his absolute power to force the tax through, Louis would back down, panic, and fire the reform-minded ministers he had just hired. He wanted to please everyone, which meant he pleased no one. As if that weren't bad enough, while George Washington and the Founding Fathers were trying to break away from Britain, Louis essentially bankrolled their war. Helping America cost Louis so much money that he practically bankrupted France. Then he did something incredibly risky for an absolute monarch. He asked the people of France to write down their grievances so he could review them. He accidentally forced his subjects to organize, articulate their anger, and realize that everyone else was just as furious as they were. For the poor in 18th century France, who made up the vast majority of the Third Estate, life was not just difficult, it was a daily, exhausting battle for survival. If you were a peasant living in the countryside, as roughly 80% of France's population did, you carried the entire financial weight of the country on your back. The poorest French citizens lived almost exclusively on bread. An adult worker could easily consume 2 to 3 pounds of bread a day because it was their primary source of calories. Imagine spending almost every penny you earned on a single loaf of bread, leaving absolutely nothing for rent, clothing, or heating. People watched their loved ones waste away from hunger while wagons of grain were shipped to wealthy estates. This extreme poverty is exactly why the French Revolution became so violent. People realized that they had absolutely nothing left to lose. But when the revolution began in 1789, most people actually wanted to keep the king. They simply wanted a constitutional monarchy in which his power was limited. Then Louis and Marie did something that angered everyone and led many people to demand their execution. Marie and Louis had a plan that ended terribly. It was largely organized by the Queen's close friend and rumored lover, Axel von Fersen. They disguised themselves as ordinary travelers. Marie Antoinette posed as a governess, and Louis wore a plain coat and wig. On the night of June 20th, 1791, The royal family snuck out of the Tuileries Palace in Paris one by one. However, they insisted on traveling together rather than splitting up to avoid suspicion. They used a massive, luxurious carriage. It was painted bright yellow and green, loaded with silverware and a wardrobe of fine clothes, and moved incredibly slowly, averaging only about 7 miles per hour. Because the carriage was so late, the soldiers assumed the plan had been cancelled and abandoned their posts. This left the family completely unprotected. The king's undoing was his own face. At a stop in the town of Saint-Menehould, a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet recognized Louis. The family was stopped and arrested. But the journey back to Paris was an absolute nightmare for the family. Before the escape, the French public wanted to strip the king of his absolute power but keep him as a figurehead. Once Louis and Marie tried to slip away in the middle of the night to rally a counter-revolutionary army, their trust was permanently shattered. They went from being viewed as flawed rulers to outright traitors who were willing to invite foreign armies to invade France and kill their own people just to regain power. Marie and Louis were forced to travel slowly back through hostile, mocking crowds. The mid-June weather was intensely hot. The carriage windows had to remain shut. Trapped inside for days with minimal food, poor ventilation, and the stench of sweat and fear, the physical discomfort alone was immense. All of this made it clear that the monarchy, emotionally and politically, was already dead. Marie and Louis's ending was far more heartbreaking than you might expect. They had started out as awkward, deeply incompatible teenagers in a forced political match. Yet by the end of their lives, they became a fiercely loyal, genuinely loving couple who relied on each other entirely. When the king was sentenced to death, he requested one final meeting with his wife, sister, and children. Marie, Madame Elisabeth, and the children wept openly and clung to him. Louis promised he would see them again at 7 o'clock the next morning before going to the scaffold. He lied to protect them. Knowing he could not bear the emotional toll of a second goodbye, he went straight to his execution the next morning without stopping by their rooms. Marie spent the morning listening to the sounds of the courtyard, realizing only when she heard the drums roll that her husband was gone. After the king's death, Marie's life became infinitely worse. She was kept in a dark basement cell and stripped of all her fine clothes. Unlike the king, who had been granted a dignified closed carriage, the revolutionaries wanted to humiliate Marie completely. She was forced into the back of an open wooden cart, sitting backward on a rough plank with her hands tied tightly behind her back. Her iconic hair had been crudely chopped off by the executioner. For an hour, the cart bumped along the streets while crowds jeered and shouted insults at her. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell. Immediately after their executions, the bodies of the king and queen were taken to the nearby cemetery. They were placed in an unmarked grave in an attempt to erase them from history. But thanks to a man who lived near the cemetery, that did not happen. More than 20 years later, the French Republic had collapsed, and the monarchy was temporarily restored. Louis's younger brother took the throne. One of his first priorities was to find their graves and give them a proper royal burial. Once the remains were recovered, he organized a massive funeral procession. Their bones were transferred to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the historic burial place of French kings and queens north of Paris. Today, they rest peacefully in the basilica's crypt. But 200 years earlier, in Tudor England, Henry VIII's inbred wife met an even worse fate. Watch the next video to discover her forgotten story.